Great, good afternoon, and thank you, Peter, for inviting me to speak today. So my name is Jim Lydotes. I've been working at BNY Mellon as a portfolio manager for going on 20 years, and I'm very happy to be here in Sydney today. In fact, this is my fourth time here in Sydney over the last 6 months speaking about the topic of global infrastructure. We spend a good deal of time speaking all around the world about this topic of global infrastructure, and having that conversation here in Australia is a little bit different than it is having that conversation in other places in the world. And what I mean by that is the Australian market is very well aware of the benefits of investing in infrastructure. It's hard to look out the window anywhere downtown Sydney and not see the names of some of the pioneers in infrastructure investing. And Australians have been investing in this space for decades. So it really is an easy conversation to not have to educate folks on why people buy the space. And people buy the space because they look to get stable underlying cash flows, high degree of regulatory predictability, and businesses that are stable asset-owning businesses. And these businesses tend to generate a high degree of yield, and that's obviously a very important consideration in this market. And I'm here to really talk about the way that infrastructure has historically been defined, and really explain how we believe that's dramatically changing. Over the next couple of years, we're going to see an emerging set of infrastructure alternative investments that we can invest in, that you all can invest in. And I think this is a unique way of looking at a space that you folks have been looking at for a good deal of time. So traditionally, investors who've been looking at infrastructure have looked at infrastructure really as economic infrastructure. And so it's what you see in this circle over here. There's three very narrow segments of the market. These are regulated utilities, these are energy infrastructure assets, and then there are also elements of transport, so toll roads or airports, things that certainly in Australia you're very well aware of. These certainly do check the boxes of the characteristics that people are looking for in infrastructure, but it's a very narrow subset of securities from which to choose from. There's really only about 75 large cap, very liquid global equities in those three very narrow segments of the market. We believe that those are infrastructure assets, but the alternative universe of other infrastructure assets is a lot larger and includes things like social infrastructure. So what social infrastructure is these are assets that are built to provide social goods. So things like aged care facilities or hospitals or even prisons. When you expand your definition of what infrastructure is, you're still getting those same characteristics that appeal to investors for infrastructure. You're still getting stable underlying cash flows, you're getting regulatory predictability, and you're buying businesses that are asset owners or rent collectors. But you're also getting the opportunity to invest in a much larger universe of securities. And what that allows you to do is be much more discerning in the prices that you're paying for the assets that you're buying. People ask me oftentimes, are you worried about valuation levels in infrastructure assets? And some of the Australian infrastructure assets that you're all very well aware of. I get that question often when I'm talking about infrastructure down here. And my response to that is, if you take a much broader view, as we do, on what infrastructure is, I believe you're always able to consistently cycle through different areas of the market where you can consistently find value. And I want to talk about a couple specific examples that we're pretty excited about today. The aging demographic of the baby boomer population. This is something that's very well known in most developed nations. The greatest generation in the world went off and fought in World War II. They came back from fighting in World War II, they got married, they had children, and now today in 2018, those children are reaching retirement age. And the numbers are actually pretty stark. If you look at this is a US statistic, but these statistics follow through in much of the developed world. If you look at the percentage or the growth in folks over the age of 75, over the 15 years leading into 2030, we're going to see an almost doubling of the population of folks over the age of 75. And that compares to pretty pedestrian growth across other age cohorts. So what this means is the group that has the most wealth, in fact, actually 50%, greater than 50% actually, of wealth in Australia is held in the hands of folks over the age of 50. The folks that have the most wealth are aging the quickest, and they also are requiring the most amount of additional social infrastructure. And we think this is actually a pretty big opportunity, and this is an area of the market that we're looking to invest in. In the US, there's a pretty well-developed healthcare REIT segment of the market. The US is a unique market in the sense that it's a multi-payer system. Most governments have single-payer healthcare systems. The US has a multi-payer system. What that means is a lot of the infrastructure that we expect to see in this space is going to come out of the private sector and is going to come out of the healthcare REIT sector, and that's going to fuel a lot of the growth that's going to support the aging demographic of the baby boomers. So the playbook for decades had been in the States that you lived close to a city, you worked close to that city. So either you lived in the city or you lived in a suburb outside of the city. And then once you reached your later years and you reached retirement age, you would sell your condo in the city or sell your suburban home and you'd move south. And you'd go down to Florida and enjoy your later days in the warmth. And that's a trend that we're actually seeing reverse. And what's happening right now is we're seeing a reverse migratory pattern of seniors actually moving back into cities. If you look at New York City, actually one of our most famous New York City, this is the picture I think Nathan was looking for earlier with the less flattering picture of Donald Trump. One of our most famous New York City citizens has actually performed that same historical migratory pattern. So he's left New York City, he's gone south, not quite as south as Florida. He stopped in DC. Some worry about his mental capacity at this point, but he is following the traditional migratory pattern of seniors. But that's actually not the trend. The trend is to go the opposite way. If you look in New York City, over the last 10 years, the percentage of people over the age of 65 moving back to the city, or the population growth of those over the age of 65 in New York City, is actually 2x the population growth of everybody else. So seniors are doing this. They are re-urbanizing, and they are moving back into the city. And why are they doing that? Well, the reasons, I think, make a lot of sense. As people age, they want to be closer to world-class healthcare. They want to be closer to their doctors. They want to be closer to the arts. They want to be closer to friends and people. They want to have more activities to do. And the city offers a great alternative for that. The problem is there isn't a lot of infrastructure that's equipped to handle the migration of seniors back into the city. I think that's changing. I think that's a big opportunity. And this is one example of the opportunity. So this location is called Inspire. This is a high-end housing, senior housing facility, the Upper East Side of Manhattan. It's a 250-unit complex that's being built right now, and it's actually owned by one of the healthcare REITs that we spent a lot of time working on. If you look at this picture, and if you walk into the lobby of one of these units, you would never know it's an aged senior living facility. But the nuances are very subtle, but they're there. So on the first floor, typically when you build a commercial building such as this, the first floor would be reserved for retail operations. They would rent them out to retailers. You're getting a lot of street traffic, and that would support a lot of the rent for the overall building. That's not the case in this facility. In this facility, the first floor is left pretty open. There's common areas. Folks can play cards. They can interact. They can socialize. It actually looks a lot more like a traditional aged care facility that you would expect, but it also looks a lot like a high-end housing development as well. Also, there are other subtleties. So the carpet, the designs within the carpet are developed in a way that would be less distracting to people as eyesight tends to go. Also, the walls in the units are painted with vivid, contrasting colors so that people don't lose depth perception as they're walking around the unit. So the subtleties are very nuanced, but they're there. And this is an example of some of the capacity that's coming on into urban locations to try to accommodate the migratory patterns that we're seeing of folks over the age of 65 moving back into urban locations. And I think one of the best ways of playing this is through some of the healthcare REITs that are paying for and are building these buildings in the States. Another non-traditional area that we're looking at in infrastructure is in telecom. I think when you talk to your traditional infrastructure manager, telecom is not an area of the market that they're focusing on. But I think they still exhibit a lot of the characteristics for why people love this space. So if you take a look at this chart here on the left, this shows Western European smartphone data traffic over about 10 years. You can see the parabolic growth in data consumption. We all see that. We see that in the States. I know you see it here in Australia. We're consuming more and more data. And what are we consuming more and more data on? Well, you see the sources of that smartphone traffic growth on the right. Between 2016 and 2022, you're going to see a tenfold increase in data being used for video. You're going to see a fivefold increase in data being used for audio, so streaming Spotify or Apple Music. You're going to see a 600% increase, six-fold increase in the data being consumed for social networking. You know, the average Facebook user spends an hour a day on Facebook. Think about that. You think of how much more productive society would be if they were spending that time doing absolutely anything other than spending an hour a day on Facebook. But regardless, they're spending a lot of time on Facebook, and that's leading to a lot of data traffic. And the problem that's presented over the last decade is that telecom companies haven't been able to price for that. So I'm an iPhone consumer. I got the first Apple iPhone. I love Apple as a consumer, not as a stock, as a consumer. Got the first Apple iPhone 10 years ago. Every 2 years, I dutifully upgraded. My bill today is exactly the same as it was 10 years ago, but my data usage is following the trend that you see there on the left. I'm consuming more and more data, but I'm not willing to pay for it, and nobody globally has been. So this is a problem for these telecom companies because they're investing more and more money. These telecom companies invested to bring me from 3G to 4G, and they haven't been able to price for that. And that's true in the States, and that's true in much of the developed world. What's going to change that is the advent of 5G technology. So if you think about it, 3G was really about pictures. 4G was really about video. 5G is going to be about connectivity, the Internet of Things. And what this is going to usher in, we believe, is the ability of these telecom companies to finally take price. Today there are 6.5 billion connected devices in the world. In 2 years, 2022, only 2 years from now, that number will triple. There will be 20 billion connected devices in the world. That is all going to be supported by a technology called small cell technology. So right now, when you talk on your smartphone, you get on your phone, the signal goes from your phone to the telecom tower and back. Going forward, under 5G technology, under small cell technology, that signal is going to go from your phone to the light post or to a light bulb, or even to small cell technology that's in the brick of a building. We're going to need to deploy a massive amount of small cell technology, and that's going to be what manages this tremendous amount of traffic. Now, does everybody know what this is here? So, all right, so obviously that's a payphone. I actually took this picture a couple weeks ago down at Bondi Beach. So quick show of hands. Can you raise your hand if over the last 7 days you've made a phone call on a payphone? I'll give you a second to think about it. Okay. So of course not. Nobody uses payphones anymore, right? Smartphone penetration, as Charlie mentioned, smartphone penetration is everywhere, right? Even in emerging markets, everybody has a smartphone. So nobody's using these things anymore, but they're not going away. There's actually 25,000 working payphones in Australia today. That's down from a peak of about 80,000. There's 25,000 of these things that nobody uses. They're not going away. Actually, Telstra signed a recent long-term contract through 2033 to maintain these payphones in the country as a universal service obligation. So they're not going anywhere. And Telstra's receiving a payment for maintaining these, but they're not receiving any revenue from people using them because, again, nobody's using these phones. So what are they doing? They are lucky in a sense because they have 25,000 of the best positioned small cell locations that they own throughout the entire country. 2 years ago, those were assets that people aren't willing to put any value on because what's the value of a payphone that nobody's using? And in 3G technology, those assets were worth nothing. And in 4G, they were worth nothing. And in 5G, they're going to, and they actually already started doing this, deploying Wi-Fi hotspots in these payphones that are, again, in the best locations in the country. If you're a Telstra mobile consumer and you are on your telephone or your phone and you walk by one of these, Telstra's going to be able to offload some of the traffic onto this unit. So that's, I think, an asset that a lot of the legacy telco operators own that they're not given a lot of value for historically. But with the advent of 5G, I think the market is going to be willing to acknowledge that these are actually infrastructure assets, and the market's going to be willing to ascribe a value that they never had. So I think this is an example of a non-traditional source of infrastructure that is legitimate infrastructure. It still offers you stable cash flows, regulatory predictability, and businesses that are asset owners. They own these assets. So I think we're starting to really expand the definition of what infrastructure is, and that allows you to, again, be much more discerning in the prices that you're paying for the assets that you're buying while still getting those very attractive characteristics for why people love infrastructure as an asset class. Thank you, folks, very much for the time today.